just got back into school for a little while. I want to practice my enunciation, keep my mind sharp. So I thought I would do some reading aloud for myself primarily, but if somebody else enjoys it, it's all to the good. And if you don't enjoy it, feel free to talk as much as you want to, as I can handle it. So, like and subscribe. I'm gonna try to do this pretty often, but I thought I would do Samuel Johnson Lives of the Poets. Start with Milton, see how that goes, and just do random stuff. I may not even finish this. Just read for a while and see how I do, and try to enunciate as best as I can. So, if anybody has any input, feel free to criticize and compliment as much as you want to. So, this is without further ado. This is about John Milton by Samuel Johnson and his Lives of the Poets. Milton. The life of Milton has been already written in so many forms, and with such minute inquiry, that I might perhaps more properly have contented myself with the addition of a few notes to Mr. Fenton's elegant abridgment, but that a new narrative was thought necessary to the uniformity of this edition. John Milton was by birth a gentleman, descended from the proprietors of Milton near Thames in Oxfordshire, one of whom forfeited his estate in the times of York and Lancaster. Which side he took I know not, but his descendant inherited no veneration for the White Rose. His grandfather John was keeper of the forest of Shotover, a zealous papist who disinherited his son because he had forsaken the religion of his ancestors. His father John, who was the son disinherited, had recourse for his support to the profession of a scrivener. He was a man eminent for his skill in music, many of his compositions being still to be found, and his reputation in his profession was such that he grew rich and retired to an estate. He had probably more than common literature, as his son addresses him in one of his most elaborate Latin poems. He married a gentlewoman of the name of Caston, a Welsh family, by whom he had two sons, John the poet, and Christopher, who studied the law, and adhered, as the law taught him, to the king's party, for which he was a while persecuted, but having, by his brother's interest, obtained permission to live in quiet, he supported himself so honorably by chamber practice that soon after the accession of King James he was knighted and made a judge, but his constitution being too weak for business, he retired before any disreputable compliances became necessary. He had likewise a daughter, Anne, whom he married with a considerable fortune to Edward Phillips, who came from Shrewsbury, and rose in the crown office to be secondary. By him she had two sons, John and Edward, who were educated by the poet, and from whom is derived the only authentic account of his domestic manners. John the poet was born in his father's house at the Spread Eagle in Bread Street, December 9th, 1608, between 6 and 7 in the morning. His father appears to have been very solicitous about his education, for he was instructed at first by private tuition under the care of Thomas Young, who was afterwards chaplain to the English merchants of Hamburg, and of whom we have reason to think well, since his scholar considered him as worthy of an epistolary elegy. He was then sent to St. Paul's School under the care of Mr. Gill, and removed, in the beginning of his 16th year, to Christ's College in Cambridge, where he entered a sizar, February 12, 1624. He was at this time eminently skilled in the Latin tongue, and by himself, by annexing the dates to his first compositions, a boast of which the learned Politian had given him an example, seems to commend the earliness of his own proficiency to the notice of posterity. But the products of his vernal fertility have been surpassed by many, and particularly by his contemporary Cowley. Of the powers of the mind it is difficult to form an estimate. Many have excelled Milton in their first essays who never rose to works like Paradise Lost. At 15, a date which he uses till he is 16, he translated or versified two psalms, 114 and 136, which he thought worthy of the public eye, but they raised no great expectations. They would in any numerous school have obtained praise, but not excited wonder. Many of his elegies appear to have been written in his 18th year, by which it appears that he had then read the Roman authors with very nice discernment. I once heard Mr. Hampton, the translator of Polybius, remark what I think is true, that Milton was the first Englishman who, after the revival of letters, wrote Latin verses with classic elegance. If any exceptions can be made, there are very few. Haydn and Ascham, the pride of Elizabeth's reign, however, they may have succeeded in prose, no sooner attempt verses than they provoke derision. If we produced anything worthy of notice before the elegies of Milton, it was perhaps Alabaster's Roxana. Of the exercises which the rules of the university required, some were published by him in his maturer years. They had been undoubtedly applauded, for they were such as few can perform, yet there is reason to suspect that he was regarded in his college with no great fondness. That he obtained no fellowship is certain, but the unkindness with which he was treated was not merely negative. I am ashamed to relate what I fear is true, that Milton was one of the last students in either university that suffered the public indignity of corporal correction. It was, in the violence of controversial hostility, objected to him that he was expelled. This he steadily denies, and it was apparently not true, but it seems plain, from his own verses and Diodati, that he had incurred a rustication, a temporary dismission into the country, with perhaps the loss of a term. There's a whole bunch of Latin right there that I'm not even going to try. I cannot find any meaning but this, which even kindness and reverence can give to the term veti laris, a habitation from which he is excluded, or how exile can be otherwise interpreted. He declares yet more that he is weary of enduring the threats of a rigorous master, and something else, which a temper like his cannot undergo. What was more than threat was probably punishment. This poem, which mentions his exile, proves likewise that it was not perpetual, for it concludes with a resolution of returning some time to Cambridge. But it may be conjectured from the willingness with which he has perpetuated the memory of his exile that its cause was such as gave him no shame. He took both the usual degrees, that of bachelor in 1628 and that of master in 1632, but he left the university with no kindness for its institution, alienated either by the injudicious severity of his governors or his own captious perverseness. The cause cannot now be known, but the effect appears in his writings. His scheme of education, inscribed to Hartlib, supersedes all academical instruction, being intended to comprise the whole time which men usually spend in literature, from their entrance upon grammar till they proceed, as it is called, masters of arts. And in his discourse on the likeliest way to remove hirelings out of the church, he ingeniously proposes that the profits of the lands forfeited by the act of, for superstitious usage for superstitious uses should be applied to such academies all over the land, where language and arts may be taught together, so that youth may be at once brought up to a competency of learning and an honest trade, by which means such of them as had the gift, being enabled to support themselves without titles, by the latter may by the help of the former become worthy preachers. One of his objections to academical education, as it was then conducted, is that men designed for orders in the church were permitted to act plays, writhing and unboning their clergy limbs to all the antic and dishonest gestures of trincalos, buffoons, and bawds, prostituting the shame of that ministry which they had, or were near having, to the eyes of courtiers and court ladies, their grooms and mademoiselles. This is sufficiently peevish in a man who, when he mentions his exile from college, relates with great luxuriance the compensation which the pleasures of the theatre afford him. Plays were therefore only criminal when they were acted by academics. He went to the university with the design of entering into the church, but in time altered his mind, for he declared that whoever became a clergyman must subscribe slave and take an oath withal, which, unless he took with a conscience that could retch, he must straight perjure himself. He thought it better to prefer a blameless silence before the office of speaking, bought and begun with servitude and forswearing. These expressions are, I find, applied to the subscription of the articles, but it seems more probable that they relate to canonical obedience. I know not any of the articles which seem to thwart his opinions, but the thoughts of obedience, whether canonical or civil, raised his indignation. His unwillingness to engage in the ministry, perhaps not yet advanced to a settled resolution of declining it, appears in a letter to one of his friends, who had reproved his suspended and dilatory life, which he seems to have imputed to an insatiable curiosity and fantastic luxury of various knowledge. To this he writes a cool and plausible answer, in which he endeavors to persuade him that the delay proceeds not from the delights of desultory study, but from the desire of obtaining more fitness for his task, and that he goes on, not taking thought of being late, so it gives advantage to be more fit. When he left the university, he returned to his father, then residing at Horton in Buckinghamshire, with whom he lived 5 years, in which time he is said to have read all the Greek and Latin writers. With what limitations this universality with what limitations this universality is to be understood, who shall inform us? It might be supposed that he who read so much should have done nothing else, but Milton found time to write the Masque of Comus, which was presented at Ludlow, then the residence of the Lord President of Wales, in 1634, and had the honor of being acted by the Earl of Bridgewater's sons and daughter. The fiction is derived from Homer's Circe, but we can never refuse to any modern liberty the borrowing from Homer. A little bit of Latin there. His next production was Lycidas, an elegy written in 1637 on the death of Mr. King, the son of Sir John King, Secretary for Ireland in the time of Elizabeth, James, and Charles. King was much a favorite at Cambridge, and many of the wits joined to do honor to his memory. Milton's acquaintance with the Italian writers may be discovered by a mixture of longer and shorter verses, according to the rules of Tuscan poetry, and his malignity to the church by some lines which are interpreted as threatening its extermination. He is supposed about this time to have written his Arcades, for while he lived at Horton he used to sometimes steal from his studies a few days, which he spent at Harefield, the house of the Countess Dowager of Derby, where the Arcades made part of a dramatic entertainment. He began now to grow weary of the country, and had some purpose of taking chambers in the inns of court, when the death of his mother set him at liberty to travel, for which he obtained his father's consent, and Sir Henry Wotton's directions, with the celebrated precept of prudence, I pensieri stretti et il viso sciolto, thoughts close and looks close. I don't know why I guess I'm just going to go ahead and try to do the Italian. I mean, that sure as fuck sounds Italian. In 1638, he left England and went first to Paris, where by the favor of Lord Scudamore, he had the opportunity of visiting Grotius, then residing at the French court as ambassador from Christina of Sweden. From Paris he hasted into Italy, of which he had with particular diligence. Okay, let's from the beginning of that sentence. From Paris he hasted into Italy, of which he had with particular diligence studied the language and literature, and though he seems to have intended a very quick perambulation of the country, stayed 2 months at Florence, where he found his way into the academies and produced his compositions with such applause as appears to have exalted him in his own opinion and confirmed him in the hope that by labor and intense study, which, says he, I take to be my portion in this life, joined with a strong propensity of nature, he might leave something so written to after times as they should not willingly let it die. It appears in all of his writings